It's Random Thoughts again, and in today's video we are going to talk about the Kenyan population before, during, and after colonization. And this idea came to me. I'm still reading Richard Meinertzhagen's diary, which was published in 1957, and it's a diary that covers the period between 1902 to 1906. His stay in Kenya during that period, that is. And Richard Meinertzhagen is the individual who ended up shooting Koitalel Arab Samoei. Now, I've not reached that point where he shoots Koitalel Arab Samoei, but even the things that he did before that are kind of interesting. Now, I was reading this part where he said he met Lord Delamere. If you're a Kenyan, of course, you know who Lord Delamere is. Is we can say, the ancestor of the Delamere family that is still around here. They own a huge tract of land still to date. Richard Meinertzhagen tells us that he did meet Lord Delamere at one point, and that was in January 1903. That's when he says he met Lord Delamere. And he met him twice in that month. I think in the month of January once, and then he met him again in the month of February, most likely, or most likely he met him several times later. I've not reached those parts of the book, of course, but I'm talking about the meetings that he has already mentioned in the diary, as to the extent that I've read the diary at this point. And he says that the first time he met Lord Delamere was during a horse racing event in Nairobi. I don't know where exactly in Nairobi, but it's just in Nairobi. I'm thinking it's more likely closer to the railway station, somewhere around there. And he says, he quotes hearing Lord Delamere talking to the crowd. Of course, it was the crowd of the early settlers, the early Europeans, the early British who had moved to Nairobi. And he was telling them that he quotes him saying, I'm going to prove to you all that this is a white man's country. Lord Delamere said that, apparently, or according to what Richard Meinertzhagen says. And he says he challenged him on that statement, and he told him, but it is a black man's country. How are you going to superimpose the white over black? And he says that Lord Delamere was a guy who was quick to temper, and he said back to him, the black man will benefit and cooperate. Now, that's the first time he meets him, and that's what the conversation between them. And he tells us, and before then, he does also mention having a conversation about the same topic by one Charles Elliot, who he describes as he was a high commissioner. And he says Charles Elliot told him that this was going to be, in a few years, this was going to be a white man's country, basically. And then he asks him, what are you going to do with the black people? He tells him that they have plans to put them in reserves, like create some spaces for them and move all of them there, and then just use them as cheap labor for their whatever, farming, agriculture, and things like that. And so he did have that conversation. And he tells us that the second time he had a conversation with Lord Delamere was at his house. And he tells us that at this point that Lord Delamere was staying in a grass-thatched house somewhere in Nairobi still. And Lord Delamere and his wife had invited him over for dinner. And he goes there and they start having conversation about the future of this land. And Lord Delamere basically kind of repeats the same, telling him that, this is going to be, in the next 20, 30, 40 years, this is going to be basically a European country. And Meinertzhagen says that he told him that in 100 years, and I don't know why he picked 100 years, he told him that in 100 years, you are likely going to have 50,000 Europeans and 5 million blacks. And that will be a huge imbalance. And I was trying to do my calculation. 100 years from 1902 is 2002. And then I'm trying to look at the numbers, the population, how population has grown during that time. And going by 2019 census, Kenya is a population of slightly above 50 million. So Meinertzhagen was very far off, even though he said this number. And it seems to me like the way he says it, it seemed to him that it was such a huge number, 5 million Kenyans. Now, this got me thinking, how big was the population on the land we know today as Kenya? Of course, when this guy came around, this was not actually Kenya. It was just land on the African continent. It was East Africa, and Kenya came into being, or some form of it, in 1920, so a few years later. But then I'm wondering, kept thinking, how big was the population then? It seems it was very small population. So then if we go further back, before the Europeans came, this land must have been very, very vacant to a large extent. There were very small groups of people. I think sometimes, personally, sometimes I tend to think that there were these huge tribes roaming this land, but most likely it was very small bands, very small, maybe 10,000 per tribe, very small numbers. We, of course, we can't have the actual numbers before colonial times, so it's hard. That is just speculation anyway. But the first numbers, of course, started coming out maybe in the 1920s. The Europeans started doing some sort of census, we can say. The numbers that I'm seeing, of course, it's very difficult to trust some of these numbers, of course, especially when they were done by the Europeans, who were, for the most part, would have liked the numbers of the natives to be a little bit smaller, so that they can claim that this land was basically empty when we came here, so these people don't have a claim that exceeds ours that much. But the number that I found, that is, maybe I could say the person who gives it is someone who we could say like, or maybe it's a little bit more, maybe not unbiased, but at least biased in the other side. And this is W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, was somebody who fought for the rights of black people around the world, in the US, in the Caribbean, and he did try to get himself involved with what was happening on the African continent. And in 1920s, he did, 1925 to be specific, he did write an article where he talks about the situation in East Africa, in Kenya in particular. And he quotes a number of 3 million natives. So he says about 3 million natives are being herded into swampy and productive land, so that the rest of the land is available for the Europeans to do agriculture. So we can say maybe the number was about 3 million Kenyans, if we use today's like defining what Kenya is. So maybe 3 million. Now, the actual first official census number in independent Kenya was 1969. And the number was 10 million Kenyans, close to 12. The exact number is 10,942,705 people. Still, that is not compared to 50 million now. So we can say in 1969, the entire Kenya had a population of, we can say, of combined Nairobi and Machakos and Kiambu, the metropolitan area. So all those people are like the entire of the country. So it's hard to tell, of course, how many people existed on this land before colonization. Of course, that's very hard to tell. There is a likelihood that at some point there was a huge population, which I don't really believe that has ever been the case, because the entire world has generally been a low population up until very recent. But yeah, so this conversation between Meinertzhagen and the Elliots and Lord Delamere about the natives and what to do with their population, because they wanted this land so badly, just got me thinking. Those are my random thoughts.